Regardless of the type or size of presentation you might give, there are some basics that just remain the same. We call those the effective presentation skills, and here we are to talk about those. This is sort of like taking a public speaking course and condensing it down into one workshop. So, the topics we'll cover in sort of a light way will be your message, why are you speaking and to whom, basics of structure and organization, preparing and planning your content, how to practice the right way, dealing with anxiety, both verbal and nonverbal delivery elements, and finally, we'll touch on visual aids, specifically PowerPoint. As we go through these topics, I will point out where the Speech Lab has other very specific presentations on these topics. For example, we have a presentation just on anxiety and just on visual aids. So if you are concerned with those areas, I encourage you to go to our website, gvsu.edu/speechlab, and see what all we have to offer in our resources. But for now, let's start at the top. Let's talk about your message. Like any paper or speech, presentations are made up of three parts: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. I use the example you see here as a hamburger because the bun, if you take the middle out, was one piece. It was one piece of bread. Someone then cut it and put the good stuff, if you will, in the middle. That's how I view a speech. An introduction is the top part of the bun, and a conclusion is the bottom part. Those will work together, and once you have one, they can almost be mirrors of one another. We'll talk about that. And of course, the body, or the good stuff, is in the middle. To focus on introductions, notice here that you want to start with an attention getter. Please do not start by telling the audience your name or maybe where you're from. Even if you're in a group setting, don't introduce your group members from the very beginning. Go ahead and get the audience's attention with an attention getter. As you see here, there are different ways to get an audience's attention. You could do things like ask questions, give a shocking statistic or a fact, or tell a story. Now, if you don't have a great deal of time, I advise you to use one of the either questions or shocking statistic or fact approaches. Let's say you go with asking a question. What you want to remember is that you need to ask a question that the audience will respond to, but not verbally. You may do a show of hands question. This is a very good way to grab the audience's attention. In fact, if you can combine it with multiple questions, you're in very good shape. So for example, going back to the climate change topic, if you want to get that audience's attention, you might say things like, have you noticed in the past few years that things just seem hotter in the summer? Raise your hand if you felt that way. Now keep your hand up if you have seen on the news that this is not just the way we feel, but it's also a real fact of what's happening. Now your audience has raised their hand, and they're going to keep their hand raised or make a choice to put it down, and that just little bit of thinking will help them connect with you. What you don't want to do is ask again for a verbal response. The danger there is that no one may speak, or everyone may speak, or one person speaks, but they don't give you an answer that you need or want. It could be that they talk an extremely long period of time. It could be that they go in a different direction because they didn't understand the question. Whatever it may be, avoid asking those verbal response questions. As for shocking statistics or facts, this is just what it seems like. You're going to cause some dissonance in your audience's mind. With the climate change topic, you may tell them that a certain amount of shoreline disappears every year. And you may add that by the time a certain date comes around, that means that this very well-known location may be underwater. Maybe those sorts of real examples of visualizing in the mind how things might look because of climate change could be something that shocks the audience that they didn't know before or hadn't thought about. Now, if you have more time on your side, using a story is a great way to connect with your audience. Personal stories are wonderful if you have one that fits, but they don't have to be personal. They could be stories that you have found elsewhere, or they can be what we call hypothetical illustrations. Those are fictional stories that get a point across, sort of like a fable. What you cannot do is say that a story is real when it's not. You can't say that it happened to you or a real person when it didn't. But you can give your characters names and tell the story of their experience. This can help your audience connect. A great touch is to start a story, get to a sort of climactic cliffhanging moment, and then stop the story. From there, deliver the remainder of the speech until you get to the very end, and then you can finish that story. That keeps the audience tuned in and hanging on to understand what happens in your story. That's not all an introduction does, though. That is the first and arguably most important step, gaining attention. But next, you can tell us your name, what you're there to do, or the project name. Then you'll tell us a purpose statement. In other words, be very clear with your audience. Say things like, by the end of this presentation, you should understand more about climate change. Or maybe if it's persuasive, by the time I'm finished here today, you should agree that we need to take action now. Don't beat around the bush. Let the audience know why you're there and what you want them to do. Next up, you'll want to mention your credibility. Now, if you're not an expert in the particular field that you're discussing, this can be done simply through citing sources. This could be omitted in many cases, but if you are an expert, make sure you mention that. Next, you'll see the thesis statement. Remember on the previous slide, or where we talked about having a one-sentence summary of your entire presentation? Well, if you've done that, you're ahead of the game. This is where you would plug that in. Again, this isn't a list. This isn't 2 or 3 sentences. This is one simple, concise statement about what you're trying to get across. So if I wanted to get people to recycle more to slow down climate change, I may say something like, recycling is one way we can slow down climate change. Don't overthink it. It is that simple. Last but not least, you will have a preview. This is where you will list off your main points before you cover them. This will sound like you're repeating yourself quite a bit, and you are, but that's a good thing. In speech world, we have a saying. Good speakers will do 3 things. They tell you what they're going to tell you, they tell you, and then they tell you what they told you. This is so that the audience can be constantly reminded of the idea the speaker is trying to get across. So if you feel like this is repeating myself, that's okay. That's the design. So once the introduction is finished, we can move on to the body. The body can take a number of different forms based on your purpose. The key thing is that you want it to be logical. If you are telling a story of how something unfolded or evolved, be chronological. Start at the beginning and finish either at the end or the current day. Don't jump around and confuse your audience. If you are talking about something that is very complex and that we need to know some background information before we can understand your actual topic, use the idea of complexity. This is building blocks. In chemistry class, you don't come in and immediately start balancing equations. No, instead, you learn the symbols of the elements and their atomic numbers. From there, you can add more and more knowledge on top of that. So teach your audience if they need to know background information. If you're doing something more persuasive, a cause and effect layout could be effective. This is where you may say that one thing caused another to happen, or the effect or outcome of an action was this, whatever you're arguing for. This is very common, but it's also very commonly done wrong. So if you're using cause and effect, make sure that you have a very clear relationship. For example, we all know that using cigarettes can lead to the development of lung cancer. However, scientifically, all we can say is that smoking cigarettes can put your body in a place that it would be more susceptible to the development of cancer. Do you see the difference? It's very slight, it's very subtle, but we have to be able to show a very clear cause and effect. Now, if you can't do that, that's okay. You can just say as much in your presentation. And that's where you'll want to get into some details about what you're really trying to accomplish. Next, and also very popular, is a problem and solution layout. This is where you just do that, identify a problem, and then provide a solution to solve that problem. Now, before you just say things like, problem is climate change, the solution is recycling, you need to go a step or 2 further than that. The idea here is that you'll want to say climate change is a problem because, and then list off the reasons why. It threatens global survival of crops and farming. It sees sea levels rising and taking over land that humans currently use. Give us some more detail of the problem. Then, similarly with the solution, tell us your plan to make recycling work. So, recycling is the action you want us to take, but why does it work? How does it work? Are there steps involved? You may say things like, just start saving your cans and recycling your cans if you currently don't. If you do that already, move to the next step, which could be recycling a different product in your home, sorting into bins, taking things to a recycling center, or ordering a can from your trash pickup, your trash collection group that is just for recyclables. Whatever the idea is, give folks a very clear plan, steps to use your solution. Last, with the body, if you're using a persuasive method here, Monroe's motivated sequence is what the Speech Lab recommends for convincing your audience that you have something under control. Monroe's motivated sequence, we have a different presentation just on that. You should check that out. But in a nutshell, it says there are 5 steps to persuading people of anything. The first is the attention step. We've covered that. The second is the problem or the need, what we just talked about. Third is the solution or the satisfaction. Again, this would be the climate change is a problem because, and recycling is a solution because. The next step, though, is new. The 4th step is visualization. This isn't about showing pictures. This is about helping your audience see in their mind how the future may look once your plan solves the problem. It's sort of a pro-con, but focused on the pros of your outcome. Definitely let the audience know that life will be changed once the problem is solved using your plan, and then tell them how it will be changed. Last but not least, the 5th and final step of Monroe's motivated sequence is call to action. This will be your closure, and we'll see that on the next slide in conclusions, but this is the last thing you'll say to your audience. Give them a real and doable and achievable action item at the end of your presentation. Maybe that's as simple as saying, go and learn more at this website, or donate to this organization. What you don't want to do is say things like, so in a few years when you are able to make a large donation, or when you're building your first home, things like that. That's in the distant future. We need something that we can do right now. So sending an email, visiting a website, signing a petition, those are real manageable asks that you can do right now. The other thing that will make your body logical are transitions. Make sure that you are clearly separating your main points. Don't just mush them together. We've all seen a paper that was one big paragraph. We know that's not the way to write, and that's also not the way to speak. And while we don't have indentation in speeches, we do have clear transitions, and they can be as simple as saying things like, now that you know about the problem, let's discuss the solution. Or, now that you know how I will solve this problem, let's think about how much better life will be once it's solved. Those are simple but effective transitions to move from one point to the other and to keep the audience with you. Once you go to wrap things up, it's okay, first of all, to just say that. Let's wrap things up, or in conclusion. Signal the end so the audience knows that it's there. Then restate your thesis. You may add the words, as you can now see, because that lets the audience know I gave you a listening goal. I said I was going to show you that recycling is one way to stop or slow down climate change. Then you can just restate, as you can now see, recycling is a way that we can slow down climate change. Then you'll see the review of main points. Just like your preview, this is that last leg where the speaker tells us what they told us. Just list those by name, no need to get into detail. And then the closure is at the end. This is where you can go back and use the call to action. If you want to, you can go back to that attention getter and revisit it. So if you asked us, how many of us recycle our cans? And then some hands went up, and you asked us, how many of you recycle more than just cans? And maybe many hands went down. You may say, now that you see the importance of this topic, Those of you who raised your hands about recycling cans can hopefully keep them up next time as you go home and think about what else you can recycle. Then you can tie that right into the call to action and say, in order to find out what these things may be, please visit recycle.com or whichever website you want them to go to. This is an easy, succinct way to make your conclusion and your introduction mirrors of one another. That's the bun cut in half. If you think about this in a full outline, it may look something like this: the introduction, the body, conclusion. And if this is useful to you, feel free to see this, and we will post a document on our website that is the outline you see there on the right side of the screen. Next, we need to think about moving to the practicing stage and out of the writing stage. And the step that bridges those two areas are the speaker's notes. The speaker's notes are for your eyes only, and they are there to be a tool that helps you. These are reminders. You can tell yourself, as you see there, that you need to move from one position to another. If you don't breathe because you're nervous, put a note in there about that. Maybe you're a very fast talker. Put a sign in there that lets you know you need to slow down. Whatever it is that you need to be reminded of, make sure that you note it in your speaker's notes. Speaker's notes are not a full draft of an outline, though they can start that way. Ideally, they'll be reduced down so that if you take them up to give the presentation with you, you don't have a full text copy of your presentation. More on that in practicing in just a second. Last thing with these speaker's notes, make sure that you use them and make sure that you don't forget to see important items. As you see in the image, there is a lot of highlighting happening here. That could actually be too much. But whatever system works for you, whether it's colors, signs, symbols, use that to get your own attention and to make sure that you keep up with what you needed to remind yourself of as you prepared to give the speech. Speaking of preparing, there's a few things to keep in mind on this. First of all, start early, and that will give you plenty of time for revisions. I understand that most of us start much too late. Maybe the night before, the day before is common. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't give you a fair chance to make changes and to improve your presentation. Start early, and then you can try out different approaches. Maybe those attention getters. Ask a friend which one would be more effective if they heard it. Give them a couple or 3 options. Let them help you decide, and that's the feedback that you need. As you're preparing, understand what the time limit is. You can't tell us everything about anything in a maybe 5-minute presentation. So you're really going to want to answer those early questions of what has to be included and what can be removed. Make sure that you're respectful of others' time, because even if you don't lose, say, points or get fired because you go over the time limit, that is likely going to take away from someone else's time to voice their opinion or to present their speech. Last but not least, always be audience-centered and prepare and plan to do that. What this means is that you're going to talk with your audience and not at them. It's sort of the difference between action and transaction. This doesn't mean that you again ask them questions they really respond to and have a conversation, but it will feel that way. I imagine all of you have had a lecture at some point where you felt as though the speaker wasn't connected. They were just saying words that had a meaning to them, but they weren't connecting with you. Don't be that speaker. Make sure that you are connecting with your audience, and we'll talk about in delivery how you might do that. As you practice, be sure to do it the right way. I did a survey once of students and asked them how they practiced. Most of them said they did not practice, but those who did often responded with things like, "I sit quietly and read my notes." That's not practice. Practicing is simulating reality. Make sure that you're speaking out loud. Make sure you're using the notes that you will actually use during the real presentation. If you have a visual aid, use that so that you'll get familiar with when to change slides or when to point out certain items. If it's appropriate and you're able, make sure you're doing this standing if that's how the presentation will happen when it's really current. As you practice, regardless of the reality that you're simulating, record and time yourself. Go back and then watch this recording and give yourself an evaluation. You will be your toughest critic, but remember that's just part of being a human. When we hear our own voices, sometimes we cringe. And it's the same when we see ourselves on camera often. Don't let that distract you. Just evaluate yourself on your ability to convey the message in an effective way that an audience would appreciate. Also, last thing as you practice, be sure that you're preparing on some level for the unexpected. In other words, if your speech requires a PowerPoint and you are prepared to go in and use a PowerPoint, what if the projector bulb burnt out? What if the file was corrupted and there was no more PowerPoint? Well, the show must go on. You would still need to be able to give that presentation. So practice with the PowerPoint, of course, because that's normally what you will use, but also be able to do it without that. Keep all of the unexpected items in mind, although it's hard to know what is out there. That's what makes it unknown. One thing we can know that would be a barrier is apprehension. Nervous is normal. In America, it is a huge fear, public speaking. Most folks in their survey responses rate their fear of public speaking akin to that of their fear of snakes and even death. It's sort of sad as a speech professor to see people so afraid of communicating, especially in America where we have a great First Amendment right. But I do understand it. Here, I want to tell you sort of the way I deal with this and the way I think will be effective for you, though we are all different. First of all, I want you to understand what is probably a new idea for you, and that is the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency means that it's always worse to you, the speaker. It feels worse when you're in front of the room than it looks to your audience. We feel as though we are transparent, that the audience can see through or at least into us and see our heart racing, our mind just churning different thoughts out, our stomach in knots. In reality, the audience can't see any of that. Now, if you have a shaky voice or if you're profusely sweating, maybe the audience will detect it. But it's not like everyone in that room is going to be able to tell just how nervous you are. I've seen students give presentations before where I thought they were very confident, and then they came to me afterwards and apologized for being so nervous. Don't do that. Maybe the only way they'll know that you're nervous is if you tell them that you are. Don't be that person. Last on this slide is you need to know your symptoms of apprehension. When you are in front of a group and you get nervous, what happens to you? Think about that for a moment. Some common examples are a stomach ache. You get the nervous stomach, butterflies, however you want to describe that. Other folks may sweat when they get nervous. I do that from time to time. Others still will have a rapid heartbeat. They feel as though they turn red and they're going to pass out because their heart is pumping blood at a much faster rate than normal. Once you know your symptom, you can prepare for it. For example, with these, while there's no magic that will make these go away, if you know your stomach is likely to get upset when you're nervous, skip heavy or greasy foods on speech day. Eat something nice and light. Don't avoid food. That may cause your sugar to drop, but have something easy on your stomach. If you sweat, many people think they should wear lighter or loose-fitting clothes. And while I think there's something to that if you're thinking of exterior heat, it's not the case with a speech and speech anxiety. Here we are sweating because of our internal anxiety. That won't be fixed by taking a layer of clothing off. Instead, wear darker clothes or thicker clothes that will hide and or absorb that sweat. That way it doesn't make it out to the audience. Just imagine if you do sweat and you wear your nicest pastel shirt and you go to gesture during a speech, and then we can see that sweat coming through the fabric. That would be a moment where you probably would feel more nervous than before. Last here, if you have a rapid heartbeat, avoid certain things before your speech, just like the stomach. But now we're thinking of stimulants like caffeine. I understand that if you need a cup of coffee in the morning, you're going to do that. However, don't do more than you need in order to function. You don't want to add stress to your heart. Similarly, be on time that day. You don't want to have to jog to class and make your heart rate go up from that movement. It's going to go up enough from your anxiety. So be aware, plan ahead, lay your clothes out the night before, and that can help you be on time. Little things can go a long way to help you manage your apprehension. Some other general advice on apprehension are here. First, gain speaking experience. This may seem difficult, but it really could just be as simple as talking to strangers or asking to do announcements if you're part of a group. Think positively. This isn't magic, but we have probably all heard the story of the little engine who could. And what we know from that is that when we think positively, we are more likely to have a positive outcome. Again, it's not something that's automatic, but if you think negatively, you set yourself up for a negative experience. Related, try to use positive visualization. This is where you see yourself being successful. Athletes do this with a golf practice swing or an on-deck swing in baseball or softball. Use this to your advantage. See the audience clapping for you. See yourself doing a good job, and that can set your mind in a positive path as you actually deliver the presentation. I can't stress enough that you should not expect perfection. In my opinion, there is no such thing as a perfect speech or presentation. I think the closest thing we have to that is the I Have a Dream speech. But even there, if you look at Dr. King's notes, there are two areas where he either went off script and didn't plan to, or almost started a line with the wrong words and then corrected himself. I don't tell you that to diminish that speech. I think it's the most important speech that we have a record of, an actual recording. But I tell you that because if that speech with that speaker had a bump in it, what do you think your speech will have? Don't expect perfection, and then you can see these little errors as just that, small and inconsequential, instead of making them feel like a huge error or a pothole in your delivery. If you're waiting to speak, think about doing deep breathing exercises. I prefer what's called 4-square breathing. This is where you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold it for 4 seconds, you breathe out for 4 seconds, and then you hold empty for 4 seconds. This makes your mind change in that you're now thinking of 1, 2, 3, 4 instead of negative thoughts, and physiologically it limits the amount of oxygen going into your body. Both those things together can help you calm down. Remember to be in top condition. In other words, get some sleep if at all possible and stay hydrated before you come in to give your presentation. And of course, be prepared. Do the practice that's necessary to make yourself feel more comfortable. Being prepared, in my opinion, is the best guard against feeling extreme speech apprehension. Okay, once you figure out your message, your audience, you're writing and organizing, you're practicing your anxiety management, let's get into delivery. We'll talk about both verbal and nonverbal delivery. Verbal seems obvious because those are the words you're using. However, when you think of nonverbal delivery, I want you to understand that that is probably or at least as important or maybe more important as the verbal elements. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. The nonverbal elements are also based in conversational style. If you think of that same person that you respect but are comfortable around, think to yourself how you might move or stand or gesture while you're with them. Ideally, this isn't something that you'll be able to identify because it is so natural. However, I can tell you from much experience, many speakers come to the front of a room and that natural thoughtless ability to move or gesture goes away. It's almost as though they've been covered in concrete and they can't move at all. In that case, you will want to practice when you're going to move, where you're going to go, what kind of gestures will you use, which hand will you use to hold your notes with, and should you switch back and forth? If you should, when will you switch back and forth? This may seem like a lot of unnecessary questioning, but when you come to the front of the room, if you don't have an idea or have at least practiced doing those things, it may feel really awkward. And we want to avoid that in order to make a clearer and less anxious presentation. Now, we've all heard that you need to make eye contact during a presentation, and I can't stress that enough. The best way that you're going to connect with your audience and make them feel as though you're talking to or with them instead of at them is to make eye contact. In American culture, eye contact lets the audience know that you're paying attention to them and that you're being honest with them. If you read the entire speech or the majority of a speech, you cannot make eye contact. Again, if your professor or employer allows you to use notes or doesn't mind if you use notes, it's fine to have those up there and to glance at them to make sure you're on track. Even if you have a statistic or a very important fact that you want to get just right, it's fine to look closely and read that part to the audience. However, don't read your speech. A speech class or a presentation is not a reading class or a public reading. As you're delivering your speech, think about your voice. How fast will you speak? The answer should be at a normal rate. Now, that's a loaded term because if you normally speak quickly or slowly, you'll need to adjust that. But the idea here is that you don't rush through a speech, but you don't crawl through it either. Find the happy medium. Inflection means that you change from one tone to another. And just like with movement, many speakers seem to freeze their vocal cords when they come to the front. They are suddenly unable to use inflection. The two clearest examples I can think of here are, think to yourself how you would let your roommate or friend know that they just won $1 million. How would you say it? What would it sound like? Would it sound like this? Hey, you just won $1 million. Probably not. You would probably be excited. Your rate, your volume, your pitch would all go up. Hey, you just won $1 million. Similarly, but on the other end of the spectrum, if you had to give that roommate or friend bad news, someone just hit your car. Ideally, you're not going to deliver it the same way. Hey, somebody just hit your car. That's not the time for that style of speaking. Instead, you'd want to say it in an almost pained and very deliberate way. Hey, just sit down for a second. Somebody has hit your car. That is what I mean when I'm talking about changing your inflection, and that will change your rate, possibly your volume, but definitely the feel of what you're saying. As for volume specifically, be loud enough so that people in the back can hear you if there is no microphone, and if there is, don't scream into the microphone, and make sure it's a good distance away from your mouth so that you're not getting feedback. Last thing with nonverbals, your appearance. What are you going to wear? I mentioned earlier picking it out the night before, and that's a great idea. But do you want to go more classic, sort of a suit and tie or a pantsuit or something a little dressier? Or do you want to go with comfort? I wouldn't say that's slouching or t-shirts and jeans, depending on your job or your purpose, but something more business casual. What I would recommend is that you do what makes you feel more confident. Unless there is a strong rule that tells you how to appear, how to dress, go with what makes you more confident. One thing that people don't think about, excuse me, are the shoes they're going to wear. Many people will buy brand new dress shoes or heels when they have a big presentation. Then they don't put them on until the day of that presentation. Well, if you've ever worn a new pair of dress shoes or heels, you know that is a problem because those shoes need to be broken in. And your feet, if you wear them for the first time on presentation day, will probably let you know that you made a mistake halfway through. Wear shoes that are comfortable. That's not the most important thing when it comes to your appearance. But uncomfortable shoes could make you rush through the presentation. They could make you sway side to side to shift your weight. These things are what will make you seem less than credible or detach your audience from you. Don't let such a simple thing cause a major problem. Many of you will need to use a visual aid for your presentation. Here, I want to remind you that we have at the Speech Labs website a full presentation just on visual aids. Here, I just want to touch on a few key ideas. First of all, most audiences expect a title slide. I would have that. You could put a blank slide before the title slide. That way you can use your attention getter and connect with that audience, get their attention, and then reveal who you are and what you're talking about. But it's a good idea to have at some point early in the speech. Regardless of the speech or the slide, don't overload those slides. We have probably had professors who put everything they're going to say on a slide. If not, you've seen this in the workplace. Avoid that. This information that you see in front of you is important. It's talking about the differences between research papers and presentations. But the next slide does the same thing. It's just much more condensed. What it does is when you use something smaller like this, it puts more emphasis on you, the speaker, to get the message out instead of the PowerPoint. If you want your audience to read your PowerPoint, we don't really need you as a speaker anymore. Having something like you see on the screen now makes the audience need you to understand exactly what you mean by things like find the core. Even though we've limited the content here, this still isn't a very good slide, in my opinion. The text is small and there's lots of unused white space. So spreading things out can make it a little more palatable. This one still is lacking something, and I think we could use an image. Now, don't just use any old image. If you look closely, you'll see that this is a slide about an overloaded slide using an image of, wait for it, an overloaded slide. So make sure that the image you use is appropriate and that it's connecting to the content. The last thing you want is an audience member to think, why in the world did they use that picture on this slide? If it's not apparent, it can cause the audience to be distracted, and then it takes away from your message. Speaking of overloaded slides, sometimes you may need to use something like this, a nice clear chart. However, there's lots of small text that we struggle to read, especially if this were up on a screen. So instead of using this, though it may be vital that you get that trend line out so the audience can understand what it is you're saying, change it a little bit. Maybe make this. Just put a box over all that text. It blocks it out, it gets rid of it so the audience isn't overwhelmed, and it lets you still focus on the trend line, and that's what you're interested in. Similarly, animations or illustrations like this one, they can be useful. We can tell what you're trying to point out in the T-Rex skeleton. But it's 2020, so I feel like having at least something a little more lifelike would be better. This slide is basically the same thing, and we can add in more labels, but it looks like something that is out of a current time instead of that 1980s look earlier from the science textbook that we saw. What about charts and graphs? Again, sometimes we may need charts and graphs. This one is pretty clean. It's pretty easy to follow. You see different divisions or categories and then different percentages for each one. I'm sure if we saw this in context, it would make pretty good sense. But what if we really want the audience just to focus on one area of this chart? Maybe show them which one you want them to focus on. Again, this is just putting a box of a different color over an area that you want to draw attention to. So today, we covered understanding your message and your audience while you're speaking. We talked about using an introduction, a body, and conclusion, and a logical structure to that body. We talked about the importance of preparation and planning and practicing so that you're familiar with your speech. We also talked about anxiety. Anxiety is normal and it can be managed. We talked about delivery, both verbally and non-verbally, and said that conversational style is very important to remember. And we touched on effective and efficient visual aids. Again, we have more information at our website, which is gvsu.edu/speechlab. That's where you can find a lot of information about different areas of presentations. What I will point out to you on this slide is that currently, because of the coronavirus going around, our physical locations are closed. And I'm saying this in March of 2020. We hope to be back in time for summer, definitely by fall of 2020. But right now, go to that website, and we have really made an effort to include more information for you there. You can also do a drop-in consultation virtually. We still have consultants available from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. most days. So come and see us. I hope this is helpful, and make sure the next time you give a presentation, you don't forget the basics.